Hey everyone, welcome to this Learn the Tech. This is show number 10, and we are Tuesday, March 22nd, 2016. And today, in our show, we're going to talk about CPUs, or Central Processing Units, what they are, and we'll have a history of some of the important processors that throughout history, or very modern history, basically, because CPUs are something that's very recent in time if you compare to humanity itself. And in the CPUs today, we're going to check out where you might be very surprised to know where there are CPUs, and of course we'll check out that the latest CPUs, a few of the information, what it means, and hope you're going to enjoy the show. So this is show number 10. We are from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. This show is every week, and it is a subject that's decided by you. You are the one giving me the subjects for these shows. So hope you enjoy and that you like what we do. So we are live from Montreal, Canada. So a CPU, that's very cryptic. For a lot of people, a CPU, what is a CPU? What does it do exactly? And what is a CPU exactly? Well, it's a central processing unit. What does that mean? That is basically the brain of every electronics, computers, but it goes even farther than that. Pretty much every electronic device we have today has some kind of CPU, and it doesn't require to have very powerful CPUs. But if you have a DVD player, a Blu-ray player, if you have a computer, if you have a calculator, they all have a form or another of CPU. And of course, each device, depending on the power required to do the job that we want, will have different types of CPUs. And so this is what makes the computer possible. This is what makes what you're seeing now possible through the magic of YouTube. Even the TV here, this 50-inch TV has a CPU. This is a smart TV. It has apps. And even those that don't have apps, most modern TVs, even without apps, still have a central processing unit, because that's the way that it can control everything. And it's pretty amazing what these things do. We started off with basic CPUs a long time ago, and now we're with processors that have billions of transistors. Think about it. In something as small as the tip of my little finger here, there's 3 billion transistors all jam-packed in there. It's just so amazing. And there's different things about CPUs. There's a law that some people might have heard, which is Moore's law. Moore's law stipulates that every 18 months, the number of transistors doubled on a CPU or on a chip. And that law held through pretty much throughout time. It's getting close to the end, though, of working, because we're getting into a period of time where the CPU, the amount of transistors we need to put in is just so big, and the union, the joints in between each of the transistors so small that these are becoming kind of a problem. And we have to figure out a new way of doing CPUs. And basically one of the ways that they're talking about right now is kind of a 3D modeling of the CPU instead of a 2D modeling that we have right now. So they control everything. And I can bet you that in your home, the amount of CPUs is probably astonishing, because you don't even know it. I've seen even toasters that have CPUs, because they have little controllers of temperature and knowing when to eject that toast, and know what type of food you put in, a bagel, a toast, or whatever. It's just incredible. A microwave oven, of course, has a CPU. It's just pretty amazing. Even some smart lights today have CPUs to control everything. Pretty cool when you think about it. But we are very dependent on that technology, that's for sure. So this is what started everything. What is that? That's the first ever central processing unit ever made. And it's made by the company that everybody knows, or pretty much everybody knows. This is the Intel 4004. It is the first processor ever. Nobody had, people had done chips that do different functionalities, but this was the first one that was really, if we think about it, a CPU. And Intel 4004 was made for a calculator. So basically, they made this just for calculators. And we are in 1971. So it gives you an idea, 1971, and it's very small, has a few thousand transistors. It's very, very basic, but it does a job that it needs to do, and it's, simply do the calculations for a business calculator. But it opens a way that Intel doesn't think of, because that company, Intel, in 1971, they're kind of searching around where exactly are they going to position themselves for the future. What exactly they're going to do? Because they have no idea. They do these chips. They're really advanced. They do these chips and everything, but they're not sure. But they understand one thing: this chip just opened the door to something else, and that's pretty amazing, because it opens the door to something that is the first 8080 chip. The 8080 chip from 1974 is the first one that actually they start thinking, hey, we can make machines that think and do certain functions that are programmable, and that this chip will just make all the calculations of how to do what we ask that chip to do for the machine itself. And it's pretty much the first chip that's people are thinking we're going to do something called a computer. I mean, the computer isn't new in 1974. There is something called a computer that is basically a very giant calculation machine in the 50s. And these are huge, huge rooms full of, lamps, these old tubes that, like in old TVs and old radios from the 50s and 40s. And these basically are a form of computer, because they compute a certain amount of, they will calculate a certain amount of stuff every second, every minute. But now this is so miniaturized, and this is thanks to the transistor, by the way, because the transistor makes the CPU possible for the first time. And it's pretty amazing. They start using these transistors that basically are the replacement of the vacuum tube from the 40s and the 50s. So this is the first chip that we start thinking, this breakthrough of the 8080 chip. Now we start thinking, okay, we can do powerful stuff with this. Very powerful stuff. But this is still, compared to today's processors, very basic. But in 1974, this is a breakthrough. These are powerful chips. They really, really can make things much, much more interesting, basically. And some people started to think, well, you know what? I think we can really start thinking about using these to do something interesting. And other chips that are notable that start, popping up in the 70s, the Motorola 68000. This was a very popular chip. It is still today a popular chip. The Motorola 68000 is the first chip that is used in many, many, many computers. If you ever add a Macintosh Plus, that little box with the black and white screen. I have one here in my museum, my little museum of computers. It uses a 68000. If you had an Atari ST, if you had a Amiga 500, these all use 68000. This chip was extremely popular at the time because it was fairly cheap and fairly powerful. It was a 16-bit chip. Now we're talking about bits. Today we're computing with 64 bits operating system because of the chips we have. The 4004 and especially the 8080 that I showed you are 8-bit chips. This one is a 16-bit chip. It's one of the first 16-bit chips that's powerful and does a lot of job. And you know what? This chip today is still being used. Not in computers though, but in very small devices. So there's now a very small version today of a 68,000 Motorola chip, and it's used in basic DVD players, for example. It's used in devices that require very little power to, or very little computing power to actually operate, but that still need some form of CPU or central processing unit to actually do its job. So this 68,000 is still available today in very, very small chips though. It's much smaller than this huge chip, which is probably this big at the time. And today they're extremely small, and they are everywhere because they are extremely cheap to process. And these are pretty amazing stuff when you think about it. Acorn. The Acorn is a machine or a computer that used the first of what we call today ARM processors. ARM processors. This were 1986. First ARM processor pops up. It's the ancestor to the ARM processor used in smartphones today. It's the processor that is the ancestor to tablets that use ARM. Even for those that had Surface RT tablets in Windows, that used the ARM architecture. And well, this is the first ARM processor in 1986. These are pretty amazing when you think about it. The 8088. This changed the PC forever. The 8088 is the first chip, and it came in 1979. It's made by Intel. It has about 5,000 or 6,000 transistors. This will be the first one used in actual PCs. This is what started the PC revolution. The 8088 is what was used in the IBM PC Junior. When the IBM PC Junior started, that was the first PC of sorts. But there was a glitch. There's something with the IBM PC that actually made possible clones. In the 80s, we're not talking about that today, but in the 80s, we had the IBM PC and we had clones. Why? Because people would copy the basic design and use the 8088 to power their own machines. There was a loophole in the laws and in the way that things were brought up that made it possible for companies other than IBM to market PCs. And that's where in the 80s we're talking about clones or the actual IBM PC. And for a long time, people were saying, well, clones are cheaper versions of the IBM PC. But technically, you know what? These clones actually work really well. And they're made by Taiwanese companies. And they start flooding the market. And the thing is, these clones cost a little less than the original IBM PCs. So they actually catch on, and they come in several types of designs. So basically, the 8088 is really what starts to flood the market with PCs. That's where it starts, really. And so the IBM PC Junior and everything, these are there for that. Other very notable processors, the 6502 or 6510, but mostly the 6502. This is a CMOS chip. It's a processor. But the 6502 is from 1975. This is in a ton of computers. And of all the computers that has a 6502, and this one is a 6510, and you'll know it's a modified 6502. Well, the 6502 is in the Commodore 64 as a 6510. It's in the Commodore VIC-20. It's in the first Apple II computer. So the first Apple II computer gets a 6502. This is a revolution. These are cheap, and they actually work very well in creating these machines. So this is used in many, many machines. This is in the Atari 2600. If you played games on your Atari 2600 back in 1982, 83, you are using a 6502 chip. It's one of the most popular chips because of the price, and it's so versatile. It can, work in pretty much every type of machine that you have. So it's pretty cool for that. Z80, the Zilog Z80 machine. If you've ever seen a CP/M machine, these are some of the first computers that run in an operating system called CP/M. Well, CP/M, all of the computers on CP/M would work on the Z80. The Zilog Z80 is also a game changer in the CPUs because it allows a whole new, set of computers and machines. This is also an old one. This is 1976. The Z80 has one thing that's really cool is that even today, like I was explaining of the processor a little earlier, the Z80 is also one of those processors that's still used today in electronics. It's still used because it is, of course, very small now today compared to the old times, but it is still powerful enough to operate small machines. I was telling you DVD players. Well, it could also be powered by a Z80, depending on what company makes your DVD player. Not Blu-ray. Blu-ray requires a little more pep, a little more power, but a basic DVD player will often have a Z80. VCRs will have Z80s. These are still used a lot in a lot of controllers in different machines. Everywhere where there's not a lot of power needed, but you do need a CPU to actually make all those calculations. And this is surprising because these are very old stuff. And you're thinking, well, these, are gone forever. They're from the past, basically. But no, it's pretty surprising. They're still used today. So we have these processors from the past. Then we get a little more modern. We get to the Pentium. Because, I could have, talked about all the different steps. The 8088 I told you was the first one that is basically a processor for PCs. And, it comes in different versions. There's then the 8286, which is a compatible processor. It's a 16-bit processor. 8088 is 8-bit. 8286 becomes the first 16-bit. Then we go to 8386. 8386, depending on the version, some are 16-bit, some are 32-bit. They're not fully 32-bit. There's kind of a little loop in there, but these are the natural works of Intel growing up with its processors in the 84, 86. My first computer was an 8088, and my second computer was a 486 DX100. And after the 486, we're changing the 586. So what should have been the 8586 is the Pentium. And we're now in a revolution because the PC is starting to really get a lot of importance. With the 486 and the Pentiums, we start having operating systems like Windows 95 and Windows 98 and Windows 2000, Windows XP. Windows XP still works on the 386. If you had a 386, not a 386, sorry, a Pentium 3 back then, you can actually run Windows XP. I've even seen a Windows XP run on Pentium 2, but it was really slow. So, this opens up the power of the processor, because now they're getting real powerful, starting with the Pentiums. And Intel is dominant. There's little players here and there that pop up. One is Cyrix. For those that have PCs and bought cheap PCs in the 90s, you had an option at some point where you could buy a Pentium or buy a Cyrix, which is some kind of a equivalent cheap CPU. And it would cost like half the price of a Pentium, but be as powerful. Problem, they heated up a lot. They made a lot of heat. They were always, having problems. And most PCs on Cyrix would actually crash much more often than PCs that had original Pentiums. So that kind of killed the Cyrix at some point. Also, Intel now really selling a lot of processors is making so much money that even competitors had problems keeping up, because they had to invest a lot of money to just search and make new processors. And these are made in these actual factories that are actually like almost close to the outside world. The air is filtered. Everything is filtered and is perfect in these factories. No human can go into a CPU factory like this. They have to wear suits. They have to follow guidelines. Why? Because these things are extremely delicate when they're being constructed, and anything can break it down very, very easily. Now, the Pentium is also remembered for one thing, a famous flaw. There's a series of the first generation Pentium that actually had a flaw in the floating point integer. That meant that you could ask the Pentium 1 plus 1, what does it give you? And instead of saying 2, it was saying, 1.999999999. Maybe it doesn't look that bad because you're saying, well, it's 2. Yeah, but a processor needs to do everything perfectly for a computer to run correctly. And having that error meant it had a lot of problems with computers, and they had to recall a ton of these. It was pretty amazing back then. Then we get a company that's called AMD. And AMD starts basically flooding our market of processors somewhere around 2003. AMD is not really well known back then. It's a brand new company, but it's going to seriously kick Intel's butt, because AMD starts producing these chips that are as powerful as the Intel chips, but for less money, and they are reliable. So what happens is you get this flood of PCs in the year 2000s, and AMD becomes real popular because for the same power, the AMD would come at $50 or $100 less, meaning your PC was $50 or $100 less. So people would buy PCs with AMD chips in it because they just didn't want to spend the full amount of money that was required back then. So AMD gets to a point where, wow, okay, we're going to sell and we're going to outsell Intel. And you know what? Intel at that point has one major problem. Like all big companies, like all governments that become kind of too bloated and don't have any competition, the problem arises where they're just going with the flow and not just, they're kind of not innovating that much anymore. And they're just, kind of trying to increase clock speed to make the CPU faster, but they aren't doing anything new. AMD arrives with these chips that basically have the speed they have comes in the design of the chip. They actually make more use of a very efficient design, which means they can have faster chips with the same amount of transistors just by reorganizing the way it actually is working out inside the CPU. So by doing that, they innovate in a lot of processors that are more powerful for the same clock speed. So meaning that if you have two processors running at 2 gigahertz, the AMDs would actually perform better at 2 gigahertz because they were more efficient in the way they would do stuff. So it came to a point where AMD was a very, very serious competitor was a very serious enemy, basically, to Intel, and that is why they became very popular. And with time, people would even prefer AMD. Gamers would often buy AMDs. They would say they do it faster. Everything's better with the AMD chips when they're playing games and stuff. And that was pretty cool. But with time, AMD, the biggest problem that they found was that Intel caught up. And Intel kind of, feeling the pressure of AMD being right there next to them, started innovating again and started making chips that were amazing. And that's why I like competition. Competition ensures that companies do the best they can to offer or deliver a product. When you're the only one doing a product, you kind of lay down at some point and say, well, it's okay, I've done everything I wanted. And Intel started innovating. But the problem is making processors is an expensive business. It costs billions of dollars in research and development. And AMD has problem keeping up with that. Partly because the income of money is less because their chips are cheaper, but also because at some point they are arriving to a point where they're making a CPU and they're having a problem with it. And they're having a lot of problems actually making new CPUs at one point, which puts them backwards, and Intel takes the lead again. And that was a major problem for them, and it still is today. We have AMD processors today, we have Intel CPUs today, but AMD is kind of in trouble. They're having difficulty financing all of that. So they're having a lot of problem right now. Let's hope they still stay on, because I think, like I said, it's healthy to have a competition in between these companies, but it's not always, easy, and it costs really a lot of money. It comes to a point where today, what do we have today? We have AMD and Intel. That's pretty much what we have in our PCs. AMD and Intel. And I get the question very often, what should I buy? Should I buy an AMD machine, an Intel machine? And one of the questions we have in the that I had today was, what do you think, of these two? And I've heard stories about AMD chips and AMD processors and Intel. Here's the thing. Whatever you buy is fine in processors today. AMDs are okay. But in the, I'd say that in the long-term use, and as a tech guy in the past 16 years, I've seen more problems arise from AMD computers than from Intel computers. There's a few differences in these processors, first of all. In general, the cooling of Intel processors is usually better than the one from AMD. The design also of the Intel makes it less prone to breaking down from heat. And one of the things that's missing in most AMD processors that the Intel pretty much always had is a protection against heat. So one of the problems is AMD chips, when they overheat, and they will typically shut down or create errors, and then your computer crashes, blue screen, stuff like that. Intel has what we call a down clock. So if the Intel chip comes to what it does is going to actually lower the clock speed. It's going to tell the motherboard, hey, we're going down. Okay, we're going to go slower because I'm too hot. And by putting the clock speed down, what it will do is simply generate less heat. So that's one of the advantages also. As for speed, you know what? Since AMD had problems actually putting out some of these chips, I would say that AMD never really caught up. So even though these chips still perform, I mean, these perform a lot. There are some great AMD chips out there. The thing is, the Intel chips still have kind of an edge because they're still, going well and creating these really, really phenomenal chips right now. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't buy an AMD. I mean, there are tons and tons of my clients that bought computers with AMD chips, and that's, they lasted years. AMD chips are still very popular. If you go, I went to a computer store, was about 3 weeks ago, look at the laptops, and I noticed that AMD chips were in probably 3 out of 4 laptops. They were dominant, and the reason why, once again, it's the market. The PC market right now is that people want to buy cheap computers. And $50 is $50. And a lot of people just, okay, that one's $50 cheaper. I am going to buy this one because it's $50 in my pocket. They don't really care that much about, and these are just so powerful anyways. Yet for most people, it doesn't matter much. As a tech guy myself, I would still stick with an Intel, even if I'd save $50 buying an AMD. And the reason is simple. My track record of CPU problems or computer problems, in general, almost every laptop I've seen that has AMD chips overheat or become really hot compared to Intel chips. These are really, really a problem in heat generation. So, all of that together means you've got, choices, but these choices can change the outcome of, how long a computer will last and so on. But it doesn't mean that AMD chips are bad. One of the notable chips also of the 90s is the PowerPC chip. And the PowerPC chip is made by IBM and is used in a series of very, very, very popular computers. Pretty much every Apple computer in the 90s up to about mid-2000 are PowerPC chips, PowerPC processors. They are all Macs are made with these PowerPC chips, which are very powerful and give the Mac, a lot of power for the clock speed. Say, for example, for the same clock speed than an Intel chip, PowerPC chip would be 2 times faster for the same clock speed than an Intel chip. But it also means that this is different because every processor that you have that is not, okay, Intel, let's just go at the base here. Intel chips all follow a kind of a progress that is backwards compatible with the original 8088 from the IBM PC Junior. In fact, even the first code from an original IBM PC that Junior that had, an 8088 chip, that code would still run today in a Intel chip, a Core i5 or i7 or anything. Why? Because these chips always kept backwards compatibility, and so the PC always remains pretty much the same architecture at the at the base. These are different. So ARM processors, people that have Surface RT that have ARM processors, or tablets that have Android and run on ARM processors, they kind of noticed that, okay, I can't run the same programs. I can't take my Windows programs and run them on my Windows RT. No, because the ARM processor, like the PowerPC processor, they have different instructions. These work with a set of instructions. And because the set of instructions is different, what's happening is that these chips cannot run, for example, a PowerPC chip will never run a Windows operating system. It can't. It doesn't. The Windows operating system has different set of instructions that it sends to the CPU. And this is what made a little war. And I had a lot of the customers that weren't happy with Apple at that time. When Apple actually decided to change to the Intel chips, they also did one thing that was major, saying, okay, but compatibility with software that runs on this is gone. Now they had a compatibility kind of mode that ran some of the stuff from back to the PowerPC, but most of those weren't compatible after the change. So each CPU, each company that makes a different CPU has a different instruction set. The reason why AMD chips run on PCs is simple, because the architecture of an AMD chip is the same as an Intel chip. So the instruction sets are the same. It's just that the design is slightly different. And that's probably the major difference between an AMD chip and an Intel chip. But at the most basic form, they're the same thing. They're the same instructions, and they do the same thing, and they're compatible together. That's why Windows runs on AMD and on Intel. They're pretty much the same thing. Pretty much. Not exactly, but pretty much. Now, a question that I had with people often is, hey, I've seen, Core i5, Core i7. I've seen Celeron. And that term, Celeron, is still used today. And people tell me, what is good, what is bad, One of the things you need to know is that Celeron is a brand created by Intel. So this is still an Intel processor. But Celeron is the low profile, the cheap Intel processor. So when you see Celeron on a computer, it usually means that the processor that's inside that computer is less powerful than most of the other Intel processors that, like an i3, i5, or i7. Celeron is the brand for the low, the more basic ones. And usually you'll see those in tablets. So you'll often see Celeron in tablets, or some of the cheapest laptops that you'll see out there will often have Celeron brand on Intel. Celeron processors today typically are Core 2 processors, updated to clock speeds that are faster and that do a little more stuff and do it better. So it's faster than a Core 2, but honestly, a Celeron today is not much faster than a Core 2 machine of 7 years ago. It's just that there's a category of chips that were created by Intel for cheaper devices. So the Celeron is the cheaper devices. They cost less. They still do the job. It's just they'll be slower doing a certain job. Then you have the Core i3, i5, i7. First of all, if you have an older machine and you see it says Core 2 or Core 2 Duo, these are the other generations. Before the Core i3, i5, i7, we had Core 2 machines. Core 2 machines are the first processors that had 2 cores. What does that mean, 2 cores exactly? 2 cores is basically there's two central processing units within the same big chip. So it means technically it should be able to process 2 times more information, 2 times more instructions. In reality, it's not 2 times faster though. It's faster. It enables what is the 64-bit operating systems, and it is more, has more performance. The more cores you have, technically you have more performance. But there's, that's the biggest problems with these things here. The problem is the numbers and everything that they show you. They're kind of, playing with the numbers, and that's where it gets kind of dishonest when you look at CPU speed and what they have in cores and everything. Because you might think in your head, hey, if I have a 2-core or a 4-core processor, everything is going to be faster. In reality, no. Because to use 2 cores instead of 1, or to use 4 cores instead of 2, software needs to be written for that. And that's the big problem right now. 4-core processors are often very little used because software is written for 1 or 2 cores. Very little software is written for 4 cores. So we buy these processors at premium prices because quad-core processors cost more for performance that's not there because the software you use, Windows for example, ain't using all the cores. And that is one of the things that, I don't like. The Intel and AMD does the same thing, that kind of a dishonest way of marketing stuff. And that's what I hate about these companies. They're dishonest in saying, these things. And they try to, tell us, oh, wow, we're going to have more cores, we're going to have faster speeds. So after the dual core, Intel came up with these processors, which are Core i3, i5, i7. And when people ask me what type of computer I would buy or what should I choose when I buy my computer, I already told you I prefer Intel chips to AMD. But if you buy an AMD, it's quite all right. And if you're looking at me right now through your computer and you're like, well, I got an AMD chip, it says AMD on my computer, don't worry, it's fine. Does it do the job? Does it do what you want? That's all that counts here. But as a tech guy, every tech guy has its preference. I would say that probably most tech guys prefer Intel chips than AMD. So typically people will say, okay, but what do I choose when I buy something? Well, I always settle and say, go where you see these Intel Core i3, i5, or i7. Now, it's not 3 or 5 or 7 cores. That's not the way it's working. They're pretty much dual or quad core in certain numbers, but pretty much the same, except there's kind of 3 categories, if you can say. The i3 is the lower of all core Intel chips. So basically, this is the entry level, this is mid-level, and this is like the high end of the processor. But it's not as simple as that. And there's a big difference in price between all 3. So I always say, try to get an i5. Then you'll say, well, why not say an i7? Well, the thing is, between the i5 and the i7, there is actually not that much of a difference because the i5 is more mid to high range. It's not mid-range. It is pretty good. The i5 is amazing. And for the price versus performance, the i5 is the choice. Of course, if for only $50 you see or i7, you can get the i7. But I mean, for most price versus performance that you'll see in laptops, desktops, and stuff like that, very often the i5 is more than enough. And I usually say try to avoid the i3. pretty much every computer I have that has an i3 is slow. My Insider machine that I use, that I do the Insider previews, is much slower than my i5. That's the reason why the streaming that you see here comes out of my i5 processor laptop, because it is much more powerful at doing the job that I wanted to do. So that's why I always consider the i5 to be the chip to get. And of course, if you got a cache, the i7 is even more, even more powerful. Then again, it always depends on what you do. But even if you want to buy a computer and don't want to spend too much money, do try to get the i5. You'll be sure to get something that's really, really nice. The i3 is missing. It does have a few instruction sets that are missing also from the i5 and i7, which prevents it from using certain features that Windows, for example, can use. And that makes it slower. AMD, you've got the Phenom FX. These are the main processors today. I'm not going to go into the details of the numbering and everything, because it's kind of complex and even, again, a little dishonest, in knowing what does what and where and how. But these are pretty much what you'll have today. The AMD Phenom FX are the Intel of AMD. So this is compatible, so it runs Windows, it runs everything. They are also dual or quad core. There's even some 8-core CPUs. But then again, don't follow the core line too much, because unless you'll use some really big software, say, a very advanced version of Photoshop, the latest version, or some gaming, sometimes we'll use that. Most of the times, you know what? Your quad-core chips use only 2. And even very often use only 1. Remember that when you're running 32-bit applications, you're running 1 core only. That you got to remember. If you're running only 32-bit applications, or if you're running Photoshop from 5 years ago, it's not using 2 or 4 cores. It's using 1, the single core. It's the only thing that it knows how to do. It needs to be programmed to use the cores. And that's the biggest thing. And one of the things that you can check on your computer is when you look at the task manager in Windows 10, and you look at the performance, very often, if you look at CPU, it often tells you the number of cores and everything, but you can visualize, I believe it's, and I just forgot, the resource monitor, I think, has all of that. Let's just see details. I don't remember where it is, but there's an option where you will see each core. Here it goes. The resource monitor will give you the cores. So here, the resource monitor is going to give you the different views. So it has CPU, but you have cores. Let's check here. If I look at CPU, CPU usage, here it goes. Here are the cores, and here's what's used. So here you've got CPU 0, CPU 1. This is the cores, the 2 cores of my i5, because it's a dual core machine. Look at the graphics, and you'll notice that very often you're doing something, 1 core will be used a lot, the other one almost nothing. That tells you, okay, what I'm doing now is using only 1 of the cores. If you have a quad core machine, you'll see CPU 0, 1, 2, 3 in here. So, and there's of course the total CPU usage. So you see that the cores are used differently. That's why, unless you do very, very extensive, powerful applications, remember that most of the programs you're using use 1 core only. So think about that, because adding cores means adding money to your computer, what will you do with your computer? Well, you know what? I find it so funny because people will buy a computer, and people with a lot of money will say, "Hey, I'm going to buy the best." So they spend $1,500 on a laptop. Thing is, a $1,500 laptop isn't going to last longer than a $500 laptop most of the time. It's mostly very powerful compared to the $500 laptop, but if it's to play solitaire and do some word processing, you spend way too much money to do a task that was easily done on a 500. It all depends what you want to do. So gaming will require better processors, faster clock speed, and of course, a lot of games today will use 2 and 4 cores on the CPUs. The latest version of AutoCAD, Autodesk, Photoshop, these use cores. These will use most of the cores. Why? Because if you are doing some heavy processing with that, lots of video editing software will want to use the maximum number of cores possible. Why? Because it makes things a lot faster. So before buying and spending a lot of money, think of what application you're going to do with it. Because in the actual usage of Windows, honestly, you might not see much of a difference between an i7 and i5 or a Phenom 4-core, 2-core, whatever. Clock speeds, be careful with clock speed. That's another place where people get, all hyped out. Oh, I bought this 3 gigahertz one because the 2 gigahertz, no, that's not fast enough for me. Problem is, it's not exactly 1 + 1 = 2 in that. Here, for example, I've got a processor that's a dual core. It's running at different speeds because the latest versions of these CPUs throttle. This is a Pentium CPU, and it throttles because depending on what you need of power, it actually will downclock or raise the clock speed up. Problem is, if your CPU is at 2 gigahertz and you take the same type of CPU, 2 cores, exactly the same time, but you use the one that the clock speed instead of 2 is at 4 gigahertz, your computer isn't going 2 times faster. It's what they let you to believe, because they're trying to tell you, oh, I'm doing 4 million instructions per second instead of 2 million. No, it's not exactly like that, because not every clock speed, or it's billion, sorry, I was saying million, but it's gigahertz, so it's billion. The problem here is that it's not every clock cycle that processes information, first of all. So there's a lot of lost clock cycles in the speed of a CPU. Depending on what the computer is doing also, that CPU might need to wait. So your computer's motherboard, for example, is going also at a certain speed, might be doing something intensive, and your CPU has to wait for instructions to get in. So that means that at 2 gigahertz and a 4 gigahertz machine, there's going to be maybe a 30%, 35% difference in speed. It won't be 100% faster. It's just going to be 30% faster. That we got to be careful, because it's another one of those things that they want us to believe, hey, that 4 gigahertz computer is amazingly fast compared to, well, it ain't that much of a difference. What other processors do we have? Well, CPUs, of course, we have mobile CPUs. We talked about the ARM processors. iPhones and iPads have these famous A8, A9 chips that are made by Apple. These are mobile versions. What's the difference between a mobile version and actually Intel chips also have a mobile version? All the chips in the Intel line that has a number that ends with M is for mobile. And why is there a mobile version? Well, the mobile version is there to do multiple things. First, it's meant to be in laptops or in tablets or in devices that will be mobile. It usually means mostly that they use less power. A mobile device needs to use a lot less power than a desktop computer, because there's a battery and you will run on batteries, and your battery needs to have as long a life as it can give you. So a lot of the chips will have M for mobile. A lot of the chips today also paired. A lot of the Intel chips categories of i3, i5, i7 often are paired with a graphics processor. It's kind of the new thing now. We're gonna pair Intel chip, Intel graphics processor. It's kind of all in the same chip. You'll have Intel with Radeon. AMD will do the same thing with its Radeon graphics adapter chips. It's kind of a new thing. Let's put everything together in one package instead of different packages, for sure. Another type of CPU, but often mentioned GPU, is the graphics processor. These are CPUs. These are technically CPUs like you have on the Intel or the AMD or whatever on your computer. But they are CPUs that were thought to do a different type of job, graphic intensive jobs. So we call it the GPU for graphics processing unit. GeForce, NVIDIA, AMD's Radeon are the two dominant players here. Pretty much every computer has either that or that. A third player that we, of course, see a lot, especially in cheaper machines, is Intel graphics stuff. So Intel Extreme Graphics and whatever are the players also. But if you're a gamer, if you're somebody that's going to dabble in graphics, you usually don't want to have an Intel GPU. You want to have a GeForce or a Radeon. Those each have their own force. I would say that right now, GeForce, the NVIDIAs, are kind of a little edge over the GeForce, the Radeons, sorry. Thing is, this plays all the time. Each company has a great GPU that you can play games with, but these are a type of CPU. It's another type of processor, but it's meant to actually display as fast as possible pixels on the screen. So when you're playing that fast, high resolution game, these are the CPUs that make all the calculations to have all of these pixels and these colors appear on your screen at a very fast pace, high rate. And if you wonder, is my graphics adapter good for a game? If it starts to, instead of moving smoothly, it will move by just, little straight moves, that means your graphics adapter is unable to process that information at the speed that it needs to. Can lower resolution or change settings in some of the games. But these are CPUs also. So basically, another type of specialized processor, basically. So that was a quick, I admit that in 1 hour we have to go quickly. And, there's a lot of information that's missed out in here. But we are trying to do our best. So today, Learn the Tech show number 10. We were talking about CPUs, central processing units, the brain of every computer, the brain of all, even small devices like DVDs and DVD players and so on. Hope you enjoyed the show. Next week, because first of all, I want to say, you are the ones that are giving me the ideas for the shows. Please send me ideas. In the description below this video, why not post ideas that you have of a 1 hour show, what subject you want me to talk, anything about technology, not just PCs, anything you'd like to know, you'd like to see. Next week, once again, subject chosen by you, how to stay safe in our digital world. And when I say that, not just computers and antivirus. We're going to talk about credit cards. We're going to talk about everyday life. You're out of your home with your devices. How do you stay safe all the time, everywhere, to avoid any kind of scam, that's trying to catch you anywhere you go. It's going to be an interesting one. I'm sure you're going to learn a few tips, and we're going to check out all the little steps from entering your NIP at the store to, of course, the computer side and the internet side of what you should not do. It's going to be, I had a show, and one of the first shows we had was about the bad guys, who they are and what they did. Well, next week's show is going to be what you need to do to prevent the bad guys everywhere from getting to you. Hope you enjoyed the show. Take care. See you next week, 6 p.m. for Learn the Tech, Eastern Time, 2200 hours UTC. Don't forget, 3 p.m. we also have on Tuesdays your questions, my answers. Hope you enjoyed the shows. Take care. Have a nice week. See you next week. Bye-bye.